a young perspective on hot-button issues around the world. This is The Hub.
History doesn't repeat itself, they say, but it often rhymes. As tensions mount between major powers, spheres of influence re-emerge, ideological divides deepen, and the echoes of the 20th century grow louder. The question is, are we truly listening? Mr. Odd Arne Westad is one of the world's foremost historians of global power and ideology. He is professor of history and global affairs at Yale University, and his work bridges the past and present to make sense of today's shifting world order. Westad is best known for the global Cold War, Third World Interventions, and the Making of Our Times, a groundbreaking work that redefined the Cold War as a global struggle over ideas and influence, and earned him the prestigious Bancroft Prize. He also focuses on China. His Restless Empire, China and the World since 1750, traced China's complex relationship with the world over the past 250 years. In his most recent book, The Great Transformation, China's Road from Revolution to Reform, co-authored with Chen Jian, Westad explores China's reform era, revealing how the country has dramatically reshaped both itself and the wider world over the past several decades. To help us understand the deeper resonance between past and present, we've turned to Professor Arne Westad of Yale University. Professor Westad, welcome to the program.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Professor, there have been a number of frameworks to analyze what's going on in international relations. Conventionally, people use the school of thoughts such as liberalism, realism, and constructivism in analyzing interstate relations. But you yourself proposed the interplay between ideology, empire, and global order. How do you think your framework can perhaps better analyze what's going on right now? If you think about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, China-US great power rivalry, the uncertainties and turmoil in the Middle East, so on and so forth.
What's striking with the world that we live in today is that it's hard to have one specific framework to bring all the sudden changes, dramatic changes that we see going on at the moment in under. So I'm in many ways skeptical of the idea that you can find one total framework, one universal framework to understand everything that's going on in the world today. But my suspicion is that much of what we are seeing today does come out of an earlier set of developments that go back, in my view, probably to the late 19th century, to when China still was the Qing Empire, and when things started to move in different directions, not least ideologically, within Europe and North America. And I think it's important to understand that longer historical trajectory, the kind of baggage that nations and people and individuals bring with them in order to try to understand how they act today. If we just look at the recent past, as so many analysts, both in the United States and in China and elsewhere, tend to do, I fear that we won't understand very much at all of what is going on today. Because the world we are looking at now is a very different world from the one that we grew up in. Very different from the Cold War world, very different from the world immediately after the Second World War. So that's my plea in terms of trying to understand what's going on today. Less universalism in trying to put everything under one heading, and instead try to draw on the broader human experience of the past to understand what's going on today.
Specifically, can you specify how the framework of empire, ideology, are playing a crucial role perhaps in shaping the global order that we're seeing right now and the global order that is yet to come?
I warned against believing that ideologies is something that is set forever, that is in a way cemented. coming out of the past. Ideologies, both on the Western side, on the Russian side, the Chinese side, are malleable. I mean, they are recreated under the influence of circumstances. But if you look at the United States, maybe in particular, with regard to ideology, I have argued that many of the ideas that the United States brought forth, particularly during the Cold War era, stayed relatively intact all the way up to quite recently. So that ideological framework, I think, is something that we also need to understand the world today. We just must not make the mistake of believing that ideology is something set in stone, never changing. It is malleable. It is both a framework for understanding the world and a way of trying to influence others.
Professor Westad, do you think Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the United States is disrupting the U.S. empirical or neo-empirical framework, or is it inheriting the old framework, just putting on different format?
In many ways, to me, Donald Trump is America's first post-Cold War president. He's the first one who has broken with the overall framework that was put in place in terms of how the United States functioned in the world that came out of the Cold War. The strange thing about the United States is that when the Cold War came to an end in the early 1990s, very little changed in terms of America's approach to much of the world and how the world worked. Donald Trump is the first one who says that he looks at the world very differently. He doesn't see the United States as a systemic power, as a power that is responsible for everything that goes on in the world. He is much more preoccupied with what he sees as America's national interest in a much narrower framework than what has been the case before. And that's the disruption, in a way. Trump wants the United States, for good or bad, to start behaving as if it were a normal nation state, with interests and preoccupations that more or less cover the globe, but still one that puts its own interests first. And that, I think, is what is important to understand about him. Whether one likes the figure of President Trump or not, is that that's the fundamental disruption that we're seeing at the moment.
But we're only going to have it for 4 more years or 3 years and a little bit more, right? After 4 more years, if the Democrats make a comeback or the conventional GOPs make a comeback, things could just go back to the same old.
I think the American approach to the world, as you saw it during the Obama years up to Trump's first election in 2016, that approach to the world will never come back. I think it's gone. I think the United States, in terms of its approaches to the world, will be very different from what we have seen during the Cold War and in the period up to the mid-2010s. If you look at President Biden's approach to the world, of course there were differences, significant differences from that of President Trump. But there were also a lot of continuities from Trump's first period in office. And if the Democrats were to regain control of the presidency in the next electoral cycle, I think the same will remain the case, perhaps even more so, because now Trump will have had another 4 years to put his stamp on how people actually see U.S. foreign policy, and not least how U.S. foreign policy is seen by the world.
Focus on what's relevant in China and the world. Bridge the gap between what you know and what you want to know. This is The Hub.
Professor Westad, but if you look at one or several pieces of main argument of Donald Trump, he's arguing for the strongest military in the history of the world. And in Trump 1.0, many argue that he's pretty much held hostage by the Beltway elites and the military-industrial complex. If you think about his hostility towards China, a containment strategy, building up the Indo-Pacific theory, emphasizing the so-called communist China, label putting up on Beijing, on the government here. What will all this mean for America's policy against China if there were to be a fundamental change in U.S. foreign policy making?
Well, I think that change has in many ways already happened. You can see it in terms of this administration's approach to China, but you also saw it in the approach that the Biden administration had to China. There are differences, but there are more similarities, in my view, than differences. So what I expect to come out of this, and I've just written a book about these parallels in terms of history, is a United States that is more preoccupied with setting its own economic interests first, It will still be preoccupied with security interests, and it clearly sees a rivalry with China over power and influence, maybe especially in the larger Asian region. But I do think that there is also within this framework room for compromise, as we are seeing now, for instance, with regard to the trade talks. But the idea that this new American approach to the world is one that cannot under any circumstance be fitted into a sense of stability in global international affairs, that I disagree with. I mean, I think it is a little bit like I say to my American students that you can't have it both ways. I mean, either you want a United States that put its own interest first, and it's less globalist in terms of its approach to the rest of the world, or you would have to get an America that is more interventionist, that is trying to do more in different parts of the world, which was the story of the United States during the Cold War and immediately after. So you might not like Donald Trump's foreign policy, and many parts of it I dislike very strongly. But you have to recognize that this is a fundamental shift, and it's a shift in the direction that many people across the American political spectrum had been calling for a long time, which is less US involvement abroad.
For decades, the China-US relationship was defined by strategic engagement. After China joined the WTO in 2001, bilateral trade exploded from around $120 billion that year to nearly $700 billion by 2022, reshaping global supply chains and lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. American firms gained access to the world's fastest-growing market. Chinese students flooded U.S. universities. Diplomacy was grounded in the logic of interdependence, but that logic was since unraveled. In 2018, the Trump administration launched a tariff war, hitting over $360 billion in Chinese goods. Beijing responded in kind. Under both Trump and Biden, Washington has escalated tax restrictions, banning Huawei, blacklisting Chinese AI firms, and limiting exports of advanced semiconductors. Biden's CHIPS Act committed $280 billion to secure U.S. tech dominance. Beijing, in return, is investing heavily in homegrown innovation. Meanwhile, rhetoric sharpens. U.S. officials label China a systemic threat. Beijing accuses Washington of containment and suppression. Trust erodes. Institutions falter. Crisis management channels go quiet. The world's two largest economies now stand not just in competition, but in a new era of systemic rivalry. Professor, regarding the China-US rivalry and what looks like America's containment strategy against China, and of course China's countermeasures, you still refrained from calling this a new Cold War. So what's fundamentally different between what's going on right now, about the rivalry between China and the United States versus, the real Cold War, from dating from the 40s all the way till the 90s?
I think it is fundamentally different. I think for two main reasons. One is that in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was in many ways isolated by its own design. Right? It was not part of the global international economic framework. It was outside of international markets. China and the United States compete within the same markets and within more or less internationally the same economic system. And secondly, there is the aspect of ideology that we touched upon before. During the US-Soviet Cold War, the ideologies were very much set in stone. They were very unmalleable. They were very unchanging. Today, even though there are ideological elements in terms of the US-China confrontation, they are of a different kind. They are much more preoccupied with trying to frame policies, frame ideas and concepts that can be accepted on a broad scale, whatever kind of economic system or even political system domestically that countries aspire to. So those are two fundamental differences. I see many more similarities between the multipolar world that we have already moved into now, in my view, and the late 19th century in international affairs than what I see with the Cold War. Back then, we had many great powers that were competing internationally, conflicting against each other, maybe first and foremost in Europe, just like Eastern Asia now is the focus point for international rivalries. And it was a much more unruly, much more unstable world, very much similar to what we have today. Now, that's the warning from the past. We know how that world ended. It ended in 1914 in cataclysmic war. And that's what we have to be careful about.
So basically, Professor, are you saying that despite the important and, to borrow your own words, enduring role of ideology, China and the United States currently and their leaders basically take bits and pieces out of whatever works for their societies in light of the globalization drive in the 90s and form whatever they call ideology, which is really a cover to sometimes confront and each other?
You could put it that way. That's certainly one element of ideology that is much more visible today than it was, for instance, during the Cold War. There are other elements to ideology as well. So as I said, ideology today, it seems to me, fills two functions. One is the one that you just mentioned. I mean, putting together something that seems to both work and is attractive for people around the globe. But the other part of ideology is, of course, what you have inherited from the past, ways of understanding the world. These are also changeable, but they change much less frequently, much more slowly than what the kind of consumption ideology, if you want to call it that, seem to be doing. So for people who are political leaders, statesmen today, it's very important to be able to differentiate between these two different ideological approaches. And very often we do not get that right. I mean, Americans tend to think of China in far too ideological terms. And likewise, in China, there are a lot of people who believe that the United States is much more rigid, much more set than what it seems to me that the United States is today. In that, if we get it right, there are some opportunities that didn't exist, for instance, during the Cold War. But there are also immense dangers in terms of misunderstandings and in terms of conflict.
In light of Trump's posture towards the European Union, his rhetorics and actions, and also the way J.D. Vance, the vice president, is treating the European leaders across the board, what do you think is the best way the European policymakers and parliamentarians can and should respond in light of what happened across the Atlantic?
So I think you see that response happening already. And it is a response that, in a way, is what Trump is doing in the United States in reverse. I mean, there is much more of an emphasis now that I've ever seen in my lifetime on European unity, on the need for the bigger European countries to stand together against the pressure that you see from the United States. The problem for Europe is that they didn't see this coming, and they spent very little time since the end of the Cold War preparing for something like what they're seeing in the United States now, which is not, as some Europeans are saying, the United States going rogue, but the United States becoming less preoccupied with Europe and much more preoccupied by its own interests. And internationally, of course, globally, on the US side, much more preoccupied with Asia than what it is with Europe. So in many ways, it's the Europeans' fault that they haven't been willing or able to prepare for that kind of moment. I think now the moment is definitely here. It's probably been around in many ways since the first Trump era. And now what the Europeans need to do is to make sure that they spend more time, more money, more effort on developing their own policies towards the world in a broader sense, not just on economic questions and on trade questions, and that's happening already, but also on security questions. I don't think NATO is going to disappear, or at least not disappear very soon. But I do think that there is going to be a much bigger European component of NATO. And I say European, I don't mean just individual European countries. I think European countries working together in order to do more for their own security. And here again, we have the strange kind of situation, right? Because this is what Trump and Vance has been saying. They want Europe to take more responsibility for its own future and for its own defense. Now, doing that by insulting Europeans is not the best way of trying to achieve it. But in a way, it contributes to the wake-up call that should have been there a long time ago for Europe in terms of its relationship with the United States. It has to be a close, well-working relationship, but it also has to be a relationship in which there is much more European initiative and even independence than what has been the case before.
So let's say, should there be a more autonomous and European-centric component to the future of NATO, and should the war in Ukraine end, or many expect that it will end one day, if not soon, what will the relations between NATO and Russia be like? The two power centers on the Eurasian continent.
For the time being, I think because of the war in Ukraine, it will be very confrontational. I think that's going to last even probably after the war has ended. So I think that will be the strongest reminder, probably more than even Trump's policy. Now, the big question is whether Europe will be able to live up to its commitments with regard to Ukraine in the longer run, even after a ceasefire has been set up. And maybe even more importantly than that, whether Europe will be willing to take the steps necessary to have, as you said, its own component within NATO. Those are the big questions that I see.
Sure. And then talking about the future of the world, what practical steps can major powers take at this point to avoid a direct confrontation? Because, many hope that to be the case. I mean, are there historical models for quote-unquote managed rivalry that might offer a guidance? I mean, for major powers hailing from different, ideologies and different cultures. By that, I mean China and the United States.
Well, we all have to hope that that is the case, because the alternative is too terrible to imagine. And on my way down to France, where I am now, I passed through the battlefields of Flanders, of northern France, and the millions of young men who died there in the First World War after 1914. So in 1914, we didn't manage to get this right. And the result was a terrible catastrophe worldwide. We have to avoid that. One of the biggest problems in the pre-1914 world was the kind of economic warfare that many powers engaged in against each other. Tariffs, for instance. It's remarkably similar to what you see today. These approaches almost never work. They destabilize the international situation for very, very little gain. And this is where I'm more hopeful. What we didn't have before 1914, but do have today, are international organizations. Global international organizations like the UN and its agencies, but also many other organizations. Participating in those fully, letting them get more of a position and room to play within the international community is something that can help reduce the overall tensions that led to war 100 years ago. So these are the kinds of lessons that we have to draw from the past. It's not about negotiating successfully, always. I mean, you can't achieve that, right? You can't achieve it on military or strategic affairs. You can't achieve it on trade. The problem is to avoid getting into a situation when this becomes a slippery slope, and where sane people, conclude that war might be the only way out. That's what we have to avoid.
Yeah, they're pretty, ugly lessons that history had to offer. In your 2005 book, The Global Cold War, Professor, you argued that the Cold War left profound and lasting scars on the global South. 2 decades on, do you see more agency emerging from the global South in shaping the global order? Can these states effectively shape the emerging order, if you will, or are they still primarily passively responding to great power competitions?
I think you see much more agency from the global South today than what you saw during the Cold War, even immediately after the Cold War. And that's for the good. I mean, it's important that the most populous part of the world, also probably the most rapidly developing part of the world, countries such as in Africa, for instance, will have more of an impact on international affairs. And you're seeing that happening already. It will be a slow process, but much of it, in my view, will be determined by demographics. So if you look at the world today, Africa is the only continent where there is a meaningful continued increase in terms of numbers. And that's really, really important for the long-term fate of the world. I do think that you will see even more agency from the global south, not just African countries, but across the global south. I think China could play a very important role with regard to this, not just through economic engagement, but also through being willing to work on an equal basis with other countries in the global south in order to deal with global international problems. Inside the UN or through bilateral or regional organizations. And I think that is really important. I think this is one of the things that China can actually contribute towards global stability in the longer run.
And finally, on China, China describes its own economic model and political model as well as socialism with Chinese characteristics. That is a pragmatic approach, adapting a theory and ideology to the Chinese domestic conditions. Drawing on your study of developmental paths, how do you assess this approach? I mean, how has it helped China over the decades meet its core goal of political stability while maintaining a certain rate of economic growth?
So I first came to China in the late 1970s. And if you look at what has happened in the 50 years since then, this has been the greatest miracle of my lifetime. I mean, in terms of how China has been turned around into what it is today. And every Chinese have good reason to be extremely proud of what has been achieved. It is a model that has worked well for China up to now. The emphasis, just like you said, on pragmatism on the one hand, on Chinese traditions, Chinese aspirations on the other hand, and the willingness to work with an open mind with the rest of the world, even breaking away from long-standing enmities, for instance, against the United States and Japan, that had existed in the past. That kind of pragmatism is now more needed than ever. China has had enormous success over almost 2 generations with its development model, but the world doesn't stay the same.
Professor Westad, thank you so much for your time and your insights.
It has been a great pleasure. Good to talk to you.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Deep Dive on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll see you again next time.